Why are we arguing about whether we need to control our borders? Let me see. If you want to have a law that regulates immigration, then you must be able to control who's coming across the border. If you don't control who comes across the border, then your laws and regulations don't mean anything. Am I the only person in America who understands this simple truth?
My wife chides me every now and again because my answers are often long. But on the question of immigration, I have a fairly short answer that I think would go a long way toward helping to alleviate our difficulties in this way. And it's 3 words: enforce the law. We are a people in touch with all humanity. And that means when we touch people overseas, we're touching somebody here, and you and I both know it. That's why our immigration law has been constructed in such a way as to take account of family relationships, has been constructed in such a way as to try to make sure that basic families can be kept intact, but also that the door is kept open to talents and abilities. It has not been carelessly put together, and precisely because of the makeup of our people, it has not been put together without regard for the human feelings and ties that are involved. But it has one overriding purpose, which I think is important for all those people. There's no point offering people the promise of a better life and then mismanaging immigration to such a degree that you destroy the basis for that promise. That means we have a responsibility to manage immigration in such a way that we can at one and the same time respect the tradition that has made this country strong, of drawing on the hope and answering the aspirations of people all over the world, but at the same time we maintain our quality of life, do not overburden our infrastructure, and incorporate people into our expanding hope as constructive elements who will be here fulfilling their dreams, not stewing because we have been so careless of them that they can no longer reach for them. It's not a question of do we have the means and do we have the capability. The question is, do we have the political will? And I think the problem arises there in 2 ways. We have some people who are economically benefiting from illegal immigration. Let's not close our eyes to this. We have folks who are perfectly minded to have illegal immigrants come in. They are a vulnerable portion of the workforce. They can be exploited for their labor and then tossed into the welfare system. And the whole result reaps profits for somebody at the expense of both the poor illegal immigrant and the public good. And then, on the other hand, we have some folks in our country, and I'm not going to suggest that they're all in the Democrat Party, but we have some folks in our country who look at this as a political opportunity. That you can have people come in and then you start relaxing access to the ballot in various clever ways so that people can register without a scrutiny of who they are, where they come from, where they were born, and whether in fact they are part of a citizen body. And before you know it, you can be influencing elections right, left, and center by corrupting the integrity of the electorate in this very direct way. So we have some forces in this country who don't want to solve the problem of illegal immigration. And we need to identify them and openly challenge them so that we can build a solid majority in favor of meeting our responsibility to our people and the world. I was asked a question about whether or not people should have access under our Constitution and laws to automatic weapons. And I referred the reporter to the factual situation. That in fact, under our Constitution and laws, such access is allowed. I will state boldly, though, that I am a supporter of the Second Amendment, and I believe strongly that law-abiding citizens should have their right to keep and bear arms left intact. The gun control mentality is ruthlessly absurd. It suggests that you pass a law which will bind law-abiding citizens. They won't have access to weapons. Now, we know that criminals, by definition, are people who don't obey laws. Therefore, you can pass all the laws you want. They will still have access to these weapons, just as they have access to illegal drugs and other things right now. That means you end up with a situation in which the law-abiding folks can't defend themselves, and the crooks have all the guns. I don't believe in arming the criminals and protecting the criminals while leaving the law-abiding citizens disarmed and telling our police that they must work under every disadvantage. That doesn't serve order, it doesn't serve law, and it doesn't make sense. You remember the law school shooting last week in Grundy, Virginia?
Well, John Lott Jr. of the American Enterprise Institute wrote a fascinating column in the New York Post today in which he pointed out that in only 4 of about 280 stories that he found on LexisNexis about that shooting did they mention the fact that, remember, there was a shooting and a professor was killed, the dean was killed, and then a bunch of students is reported to have subdued the shooter. You know what they failed to tell you? They failed to tell you that 2 of the students who initially were able to subdue that gunman were themselves armed. They ran, got their weapons out of their vehicles, came back, pointed them in the direction of the gunman, were able to disarm him, and then other students joined them in subduing him. Now think about that. Why is it that they use things like this as the poster stories of gun control, and yet when you examine the fact of an episode like this, it turns out that guns were used by law-abiding citizens to avoid greater death and mayhem. And in fact, there are a lot of reason to believe that when responsible citizens are encouraged in the appropriate, responsible, and educated use of firearms in self-defense, they are able to avert disaster. Not a bullet was fired by them in doing this, and that happens hundreds of thousands of times every year. But you don't read it in the press. That's more than bias. That's the kind of thing that could distort our judgment and lead us into a very bad mistake about our own.
As a matter of fact, everything that has come from the Pope and the Holy See has made it clear that abortion and capital punishment are at different levels of moral concern. Abortion is intrinsically, objectively wrong and sinful, whereas capital punishment is a matter of prudential judgment, which is not in and of itself a violation of moral right. And that has been made clear in every pronouncement, including Cardinal Ratzinger's latest communication, including the interpretation of American bishops and cardinals. That distinction is fundamental. And it's one that folks in the media and others seem not to understand. There are certain issues that objectively violate the most fundamental canons of moral decency. And abortion, for instance, is one of them, the taking of innocent life. The question of whether or not you should apply capital punishment in an instance where someone has been found to be guilty is something that depends on circumstances, that depends on judgments about efficacy and balancing the results against what is, in fact, to be affected in capital punishment. And that is an area where Catholics, as others, have the right to debate, to disagree, and to exercise their judgment and common sense, which, of course, is what I do. But if you take a position that effaces the distinction between innocent life and guilty life, then you not only violate a moral canon, you destroy the fundamental basis of the law. And that is the ultimate disrespect for human life. And in point of fact, it is the slaveholders' position. The slaveholders took the view that black people were not developed enough to be treated as human beings and therefore could be bought and sold like animals. People looking at the babe in the womb take the view that that child is not developed enough to be treated as a human being and therefore can be killed at will. I think that's the same position in principle, and it violates the fundamental principle of our way of life, that we are not developed nor born, but created equal and endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. I have heard that in New York, you remember that wonderful flag-raising moment when the 3 firemen raised the flag? Some folks had suggested to doing a statue that commemorated that moment. And then some bureaucrat decided for reasons of political correctness you'd have to not represent the original fireman, but a black person and some other person and so forth. I think that person entirely misunderstood the moment. When I remember that moment, I remembered their great grief. I remember their great faith and that sense that the flag would still be there. But the thing I mostly remember is that in that moment we transcended all those differences. We were just Americans. And all I remember is our pride. That's my sense of it.